It is my pleasure first to introduce Professor Dr. Henrieke Stahl, who comes to us from Universität Trier, an expert on Russian literature, especially poetry and philosophy, whose previous work has focused on topics such as Andrei Belly and his works. She currently runs a network, a scholarly network that focuses on lyric Russian poetry between Europe, Asia, and America, which I hope I've summarized correctly. And she'll be talking to us today about imperial conflicts and historical traumas in Eastern European poetry, which I'm quite looking forward to. And I will pass it over to her, please.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I greet you warmly from Trier and apologize that unfortunately I could not come to Poznan. And please excuse me that I can only come to my own lecture today. I've been with Corona for 2 weeks and unfortunately I'm still not well again. And also I apologize that my voice might not be very clear in the lecture. So let's start. I have defined the topic of my presentation a bit more concretely, and I want to focus on a case study. Now I will share my screen. Please, the host might give me the right to share my screen. Okay, now it should work. So, can you see my presentation? I hope so.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. My topic now is named Mazeppa contra Peter, Slavic epic poems in the field of history and politics. Peter the Great waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It would seem that he won that war with Sweden. He took something from them. He did not take anything from them. He returned what was Russia's. Apparently, it is also our lot to return what is Russia's and strengthen the country. These are the words of Vladimir Putin spoken to a circle of young entrepreneurs on June 9 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the birth of Peter, which have since caused indignation in the Western media as an expression of neo-imperial legitimacy. Peter was the first Russian Tsar to call himself Imperial and represents the transformation of the Muscovite state into the Russian Empire. In Poltava, the monument to Peter I was recently covered up, rather than taken down, as is currently happening to Pushkin monuments in Ukrainian cities. Pushkin is not only unpopular in Ukraine at present because he's considered the Russian national poet, but also because of his poem Poltava, the epilogue of which praises Peter as the hero of Poltava and envisions a monument to him in the citizenship of the northern state. This northern state includes, among others, the territories of today's Ukraine, which, with the defeat of Poltava, lost the relative independence that it had possessed at that time within the framework of the Hetmanate. Literature, however, can be more resistant than historical persons, realia, or artifacts, in that it can prove resistant to appropriation by ideological attributions or even serve as an antidote with potential subversive explosive power. Pushkin's Poltava at any rate belongs to such texts with a critical discursive potential. The political power of the poem is also relevant today and should, if you will allow me to put it pointedly, rather conversely lead to the removal of Pushkin monuments in Russian cities. Since the poem in fact contradicts Putin's line of neo-imperial expansion. However, this critical potential lies somewhat buried. To excavate this layer of the poem is the aim of my current presentation. Thus, I will examine Pushkin's Poltava in terms of a presentation of history, with a focus on Ukrainian-Russian relations, and elaborate upon the political implications of Pushkin's poem, which were explosive even at that time. In doing so, however, we must take a detour through another text, Ivan Volkov's Mazeppa from 2014. This poem, which is far more extensive, at around 80 pages, is a kind of counterfactual complement to Pushkin's Poltava. It not only shows the topicality of the classic, but it is also suitable for sharpening our perception of the potential subversiveness hidden in the poem. The methodological design of my lecture consists of a combination of approaches. I work with a structural hermeneutic analysis that is applied equal to the texts themselves and to their historical and cultural context. I follow a discursive theoretical approach of the primacy of constructive access to history, which, as Jacques Rancière has shown, historiography shares with literature. That is to say, there are no facts without selection and perspectivizing conceptualization. I also view history and literature through the lens of histoire croisée, which sharpens our perception of transnational entanglements beyond and below the surface of dominant patterns or order. The presentation will be conducted in 3 sections. First, I will outline the central historical reference points and the history of motives associated with them. And then I will provide individual analysis of Volkov's and Pushkin's poems. The material of the 2 epic poems to be discussed is set in the context of the so-called Great Northern War, 1700 until 1721 under Peter I, at the end of which the Swedish superpower broke up and Muscovy became the Russian Empire with its new capital, St. Petersburg. The protagonist of the epic poems is Ivan Stepanovich Mazeppa, who came from the Ukrainian nobility. Mazeppa, who had studied at the Mohyla Academy in Kiev, as well as in several countries of Western Europe, also in Warsaw, had been elected hetman of the Dnieper Cossacks in 1687. That is, he was both a military and a state leader. In 1703, Mazeppa united under himself the so-called right bank and left bank, that means seen from the Dnieper River, of Ukraine. The hetmanate was self-governing, but only limitedly sovereign, because it had been under a protectorate treaty with Muscovy since 1654. On the one hand, the treaty was intended to protect the hetmanate from attacks by Poland, Lithuania, the Crimean Tatars, or the Ottomans. On the other hand, it provided for military and other services to the Russian Tsardom in return. The hetman and the army were subordinated to the Tsar by oath of allegiance. Sorry. However, the interpretation of the treaty differs. Since 1654, the Tsar had called himself autocrat of the whole of Greater and Lesser Russia, and considered the so-called Lesser Russia as a father's inheritance of fiefdom. Whereas from the Ukrainian point of view, it was an alliance of 2 independent states. Let's go to the key events. In March 1508, the general judge of the hetmanate, Vasily Kochubey, denounced Mazeppa for treason to Tsar Peter, and that for the 2nd time. Peter again did not acknowledge the complaint. Kochubey, along with his comrades in arms, was at this time executed. At the end of October 1508, Mazeppa actually switched allegiance to King Charles XII of Sweden. Peter condemned Mazeppa as a traitor to the state and discredited him. Mazeppa was symbolically hanged as a puppet, demonized with an order of Judas created especially for him, and excommunicated by the Orthodox Church with anathema, the church ban. Peter then aimed to destroy the rebellious Cossacks adhering to Mazeppa. Thus, he ordered the Hetman city and fortress of Baturin to be razed to the ground at the beginning of November 1708. On June 27, 1709, the Battle of Poltava took place, which ended with the flight of the Swedish king Charles XII and Mazeppa to the Ottoman Empire in Bender, today Moldavia, where Mazeppa died in September 1709 at the age of 70. As a result, the Hetmanate lost its independence and was officially incorporated into Muscovy and the empire. The literary artistic material history around Mazeppa gains international scope with Lord Byron's famous poem from 1819, from which the epigraph of Pushkin's poem is taken. Based on Voltaire's History of Charles XII, Byron's poem focuses on a legend from the hetman's youth, who, as punishment for his liaison with the wife of a Polish nobleman, was chased away, bound naked backwards on the back of a horse, which gave rise to an international fashion wave around the motif. Juliusz Sławatsky, on the other hand, who penned a tragedy that was actually a kind of mystery drama, in 1839, showed the young Mazeppa as a noble defender of virtue. Another strand of motives is devoted to his so-called betrayal, conversely the valorization of Mazeppa's fight for freedom. Thus, in the poem Wojnarowski by the Decembrist Kondraty Reliev, himself executed in 1826, Mazeppa is portrayed as a freedom fighter. But there's also a note of discord when the Reliev mentions the alleged seduction of Kochubey's daughter. This is where Pushkin's poem comes in, taking up the relationship between the daughter Maria, real name is Motrya, and Mazeppa, at the occasion for Kochubey's betrayal in order to avenge the dishonor of his family. The love intrigue, which culminates in Kochubey's execution by Mazeppa, fills Pushkin's narrator with apparent indignation toward the latter. That he knows of no sanctuary, that he knows of no mercy, that he loves nothing, that he wants to shed blood like water, that he despises freedom, that there is no fatherland for him. But should we take Pushkin's narrator so readily at face value? Let us now look at Ivan Volkov's poem. The Kostroma-based poet Ivan Volkov, born in 1968, describes his poem, published in 2014, as a remake of Pushkin's Poltava. He takes up the poetic form of the iambic tetrameter with differing rhyme patterns and stanza lengths, as well as an alternation between the authorial narrator and dialogue. Moreover, he repeatedly intersperses his texts with little quotations from Poltava and also from Pushkin's poem dedicated to Peter I, the Bronze Horseman. The minimal approach to multilingualism in Pushkin's poem, which contains so-called Little Russia realia, such as the ruling insignia of the hetman Bunchuk I Bulava, and also the Ukrainism cut executioner, is systematically expanded. The multi-ethnic composition of the hetmanate is reflected in the linguistic admixture of Russian with numerous Ukrainisms as well as Polonisms and even German. And this is where the discrepancies between the 2 points begin. That on the one hand, aim at correcting Pushkin's text, and on the other hand, attempt to fill in its blanks. Let us take a closer look at a selection of them. Volkov not only expands Pushkin's 3 songs to 7, but also changes its plot structure. If Pushkin's poem advances its narrative tension chronologically, Jumping from plot climax to plot climax, Volkov disregards chronology and arranges his scenes according to argumentative logic. The reasoning behind Mazeppa's chains of loyalties, for instance, is first discussed in Song 4, near the middle of the poem, effectively bisecting the twofold betrayal thematized in Song 1 to 3 and the consequences of it that occur in the songs 5 to 7. Thus, a changed conception of history is expressed, while Pushkin's narrator develops a teleology that leads to Peter's heroic victory at Poltava and pays homage to a founding myth that gives it legitimacy in verse tradition. Volkov's poem knows neither teleology nor history making heroes. Rather, history is shown as a concatenation of circumstances, both intentional and unintentional, which is to say, accidental. Volkov's deromanticization of Pushkin's poem also determines the overall treatment of plot elements and characters. Thus, Volkov eliminates the love intrigue and reduces it to the historical fact of Mazeppa's rejection of Mothra. Kochubey's motive is accordingly no longer justified as a romantic revenge. Rather, in Volkov's poem, he acts out of concern for position and public envy. As Judge General, he's only the second in the hetmanate, and Mazeppa is much richer. Finally, Kochubey belongs politically to the camp of those who impatiently press for a break with Moscow and have no understanding for Mazeppa's loyalty to the Tsar. In Volkov, moreover, a different portrayal receives even more emphasis and indeed opens the poem. Mazeppa, in order to protect his hetman city of Baturin, brings the Cossack colonel Ivan Nosov and his troops into the city before leaving to join Charles XII. Nosov then betrays the fortress to the Russian besieger Menshikov, who easily takes it. In Volkov's poem, the fall of Baturin has an indirect but profound effect upon the Battle of Poltava. Charles XII, no longer trusting the Cossacks after Baturin's capture, refuses to give them strategically important positions in the battle. Mazeppa's well-intentioned but ultimately foolhardy decision to trust Nosov, coupled with the highly heterogeneous composition of the Cossack community, brings about Baturin's fall and indirectly contributes to the subsequent defeat at Poltava. Instead of the Battle of Poltava itself, Volkov accordingly places the greater focus on the so-called tragedy of Baturin. You can see a quotation on the slide, which occurs only in passing in Pushkin's poem. In doing so, Volkov further deromanticizes the depiction of military action itself by, on the one hand, detailing the extent of the destruction of Baturin. The city and its surroundings are run through the proverbial meat grinder, and on the other hand, drawing our attention to its brutal civil aftermath, which culminates in a carnival of executions and all manner of excesses of cruelty. In the city of Baturin itself, Volkov identifies a monument to Baroque high culture civil society, built by its own free citizens with the patronage of Mazeppa, which Volkov contraposes to Petersburg, which had only been under construction since 1703, and as Volkov emphasizes, had been built on the bones of slaves, including the hetmanate's Cossacks. Volkov thus reverses the cultural valuation of Pushkin, who had associated Ukraine with seething chaos and contrasted this with an ascendant Russian Empire characterized by structure and order. Thus, both poems narrate a transition between epochs, but their perspectives are reversed. If Pushkin lauds the rise of a new epoch of the Russian Empire, Volkov mourns the end of an epoch, that of the independent hetmanate. and he retells the events leading to Poltava from a Ukrainian point of view. The portrayal of Mazeppa is also correspondingly different. Volkov portrays him as a far-sighted and skillful diplomat who insists first and foremost on the rule of law, both in the hetmanate, where he binds himself by oaths to the common good, and vis-à-vis his contractual ally, Muscovy. And here we arrive at the very different reasons that Pushkin and Volkov provide for Mazeppa's change of sides. In Pushkin's poem, it is the so-called mustache intrigue. Mazeppa claims that Peter grabbed him by the mustache because he had spoken a bold word. Now he reasons that time is ripe to obtain his sworn revenge with the help of Charles XII. He plans to deliver Peter a crushing blow. Earlier, Pushkin's Mazeppa does also suggest a politically grander rationale, namely that it's about time for Ukraine to be an independent state. But more on this later. Volkov, on the other hand, supplies a whole range of reasons for Mazeppa to choose his course of action. His decision is triggered by Peter's breach of Ukraine's Treaty of Protection, and even more so by a new threefold order that provides for, first, the cession of right-bank Ukraine to Poland, second, the cession of 7 large cities, including Kiev, to Muscovy, and third, the implementation of a military administrative reform which would divide the Cossacks between the army and the peasantry, in effect abolishing the hetmanate. Moreover, in Volkov's poem, Mazeppa is horrified by Peter's proposal to use a scorched earth policy for impeding Charles' advance towards Moscow by depriving him of winter supplies. Volkov's poem thus corrects Pushkin's text. On the one hand, through re-evaluation of given characters and events, on the other, by reweighting their presentation in the narrative structure. The guiding principle here is a systematic deromantisation directed at dismantling the justificatory narratives that Pushkin's narrator puts forward. It is precisely this narrator that Volkov's own narrative technique casts in a new light. For Volkov's narrator also rants and polemicizes. But his speech is very obviously de-hierarchized, becoming a mouthpiece for the viewpoints and perspectives of various people or groups, without this being directly or formally indicated. For example, as long as the old Kodra is in power, freedom is unattainable. There's no freedom under Mazeppa. He has sold these muds, his own steps for the boulevard, and put himself under Menshikov. Volkov thus reveals the central procedure of Pushkin's poem, the illusory authoriality of the narrator. Let us now follow this hint and read Poltava again, examining the narrator's storytelling on the basis of the facts he tells us and also those that he omitted. As I hope will be seen behind the narrator's speech, there is another story. It is in fact not so different from what Ivan Volkov's poem says about Mazeppa. At the same time, the romantic facade of the poem crumbles with the uncovering of this story within the story. Pushkin's narrator hardly misses an opportunity to insult Mazeppa. He has a deceitful, cruel, and depraved soul, is an evil and merciless old man, and so on and so on. And yet, this terrible find is beloved by the beautiful young Maria, and, as is specifically shown, not so much out of an erotic infatuation as out of intellectual conviction. She sings his songs, she appreciates his education, his speeches, his political views, and not least his fight for the independence of Ukraine. In their relationship, an astonishing moment is revealed. It is Maria who resolutely confronts Mazeppa in the second song in order to discover the reason for his apparent turning away from her. In the mirror of Maria's eyes, we glimpse the other Mazeppa, the poet, the philosopher of freedom, and the clever diplomat. For this Mazeppa, she sacrifices everything, even her social status, since she cannot marry him as his godchild. And in the end, she's ready to give up even her father's life as well as her own for Mazeppa's struggle for freedom. But does Mazeppa then destroy Maria and her family without honor or conscience? Not only does the fact that he withhold the truth from her in order to protect her speak against this, but also in how Kochubei's execution unfolds. It is inevitable, tragic. The narrator is lying when he says, and with bloodthirsty tears in his cold audacity, the villain demands their execution. In reality, Mazeppa has no other choice. If he were to confirm Kochubei's betrayal, he would have to hand himself over to Peter and thus also abandon his plan to beat Peter with Charles and secure Ukraine's independence. Thus, Pushkin allows Mazeppa himself to remark. Himself, the haughty free spirit, himself he sharpens the axe. Otherwise, my blood would have to flow. And when Mazeppa, being in the garden, hears a cry from the castle, which he associates with Kochubei's torture, an answering cry escapes from him, the same war cry as he cried out earlier when he galloped with him with this Kochubei, the flame of battle. The poem, moreover, gives us good reason to interpret the appearance of the mad Maria in the third song as Mazeppa's dream, and thus as an expression of his conscience. For his sleep is described as restless, and rested not because of the lost battle of Poltava, as is specifically noted, but because he had passed by the destroyed Kochubei estate that evening. He then suddenly wakes because someone was leaning over him. He himself wonders if it is a dream. In any case, it is highly improbable that Maria could pass by the camp guards unnoticed and then also happen to encounter the sleeping Mazeppa. And now, finally, as to Mazeppa's ostensible motive, which is linked to the mustache intrigue. Is it really just about a trait of honor, about Mazeppa wanting to avenge an insult? Pushkin himself drew attention to this in an essay from 1830, in which he writes that, I quote, pulling a Pole or a Cossack by the mustache is the same as grabbing a Russian by the bird. In doing so, he does not reveal the semiotics of the mustache, but therein lies its very essence. It stands for Cossackism itself, and thus for the freedom of the warrior to choose his hetman. The grip on the mustache after Mazeppa's bold word signifies precisely this, the abolition of Cossackdom, and with it, the sovereignty of the hetmanate. Pushkin's Mazeppa is an avenger of his own honor only on the surface of the narrative. In fact, the political core of the matter is at stake. But if Mazeppa can be rehabilitated behind the back of Pushkin's narrator and turn from a revenge-driven traitor into a politically conscious freedom fighter, does Peter at least remain the hero of Poltava? I don't see that either. Shortly before the battle begins, Mazeppa diagnoses the situation, which forces him to realize his own mistake, namely that he was mistaken about Charles, who did not have the necessary military power. My aim is clearly lost. What is to be done? I have committed a fatal blunder. I made a mistake in this call. I am ashamed for a warlike vagabond. I was enthusiastic in my old age. Pushkin's epigraph from Byron's Mazeppa also points in this direction. The power and glory of the war, faithless as the vain votaries men, had passed to the triumphant Tsar. It is not Mazeppa who is faithless. but Fortuna, who hands over the scepter of victory to Peter. Or to put it in another way, Peter triumphs because Mazeppa was mistaken. Thus, the justification for the romantic narrative collapses. It is not the hero who makes history, but the unforeseen concatenation of historical circumstances. Still, Mazeppa fails tragically in the hidden story of Pushkin's poem, that is, in the execution of his well-thought-out plan. Maria also ends tragically, probably not in madness as Mazeppa's dream would have it, but if one takes her willful and energetic character seriously, by a suicide that is only faintly suggested. At the end of Song 2, two women leave the execution site, but only one remains, and the mother alone carries into the darkness of banishment, sorrow, and poverty. Every trace of Maria, meanwhile, has disappeared. The double tragedy, the loss of Maria, the defeat of Charles and Mazeppa at Poltava, is actually one and the same because Maria was introduced at the beginning of the first song as the incarnation of the natural beauty of Ukraine itself. She thus stands metonymically for Ukraine. Her whole self-determined existence in the hetmanate was lost with the Battle of Poltava. And yet, why should Pushkin hide this story behind and in the fissures of the story of his polemical narrator? This topic is worth a lecture of its own. With an eye on the clock, I will leave it here with a few hints. Since 1826, Pushkin had a personal censor, namely Tsar Nikolai I. Even if the day-to-day business was handled by Count Alexander Benkendorf, who since 1826 was the head of the so-called Third Department, the Sacred Polis. At the time of the poem's composition, moreover, Pushkin had two censorship proceedings in progress, one of which concerned his 1825 freedom poem on the French poet André Chénier, who was executed in 1794. If that weren't enough, at the time of the composition of Poltava, Nikolai I declared war on the Ottoman Empire in April 1828, and in doing so, recruited soldiers in Ukraine. Let us come to some final conclusions. Both poems renew the tradition of the verse epic. In doing so, they transform classical features that the tradition has developed from Homer and Virgil to Dante and Tasso and Mikhail Cheraskov's Rosiada. Of central importance to the epic is a choice of historical material that provides a legitimizing founding story for, as Virgil's Aeneid puts it, a reign without end, imperium sine fine. However, whether through the combination of romantic and ballad elements in Pushkin or through the postmodernist construction of Volkov, this founding story is inverted anti-imperially. Both ultimately focus on the tragedy of Ukraine's downfall and expose Russia's imperial gesture. The heroic panegyric in each case also becomes fragile. Neither Mazeppa nor Peter are masters of history, but the omniscient poet in whose role the epic narrator is traditionally expected is especially affected by this transformation. Pushkin uses him as a mask, or as he writes in the dedicatory poem to Poltava, as a dark muse, that is, as a procedure of obscuring or concealing the striving of my heart, which the dedicatory poem invites the reader to understand. However, even as they focus on the tragedy of Ukraine's lost struggle for independence, these poets also use it to reflect upon the lack of freedom in Russia itself, which was biographically true for Pushkin as well as for Volkov. Their poems are thus not so much texts about history as agents of history, for they expose the political driving forces behind the carefully constructed or even fictional character of history itself. In this way, they appeal to an inquiring, critical evaluation that does not take at face value anything that propaganda would like to impose, and that does not stand up to logical and factual examination. For these reasons, I would suggest that Pushkin as well as Volkov should be included with their poems in the Porter Row Russian Oppositional Arts Review, opened on April 24th, to which I would like to refer in conclusion. Recently, its second number has appeared, and there's an English version too. Of the first number, there's a French version, and the second has also a Japanese version. So, and on the last slide, you can see a selection of my sources. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
So, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Stahl. As a specialist of poetry myself, who put it aside and instead spoke on epic today, I appreciate that someone has brought the topic of poetry into our discussion on empires. But I invite questions, since I'm sure there will be many. If I may ask out of ignorance, how accessible would this poetry be? Would it be something that lay people could engage with, or is it more reserved for in its audience?
Oh, the case with the poem of Pushkin is difficult. This poem is most read as a praise of Peter I and of the Russian Empire construction. And so it is difficult to understand that this narrator is a fake. This is a fake narrator. If you well know Pushkin, you can feel it. There's no other poem of Pushkin with such a narrator that accuses the hero in such a way and is praising Peter without any doubts about Peter. This is incredible. If you read some notes of Pushkin in his diaries, for instance, you can see that he's wondering why Peter is such a cruel person. But on the other side, he also sees the impact Peter had on Russian history, and he's proud of these results too. But on the other hand, Pushkin is well aware of all problems Peter's character has. He murdered his own son, and so on and so on. And he built up Petersburg on the bones of the slaves, and so on. And so Pushkin is well aware of all these problems, but the Tsar at his time, Nikolai I, after the movement, the rebellion of the so-called Decembrists, this Nikolai I is a Polish Tsar, we can say, and building up an empire, and he is well aware that we can say, the follower of Peter I. And he understands himself in the same way as Peter I. And if Pushkin would have criticized Peter I, he would implicitly criticize Nikolai I. And Pushkin indeed is doing this, but in a very hidden way, so that the censorship could not read it, but because there is such a praise of Peter and the condemnation of this Mazepa, this cruel boy and stupid boy and so on. And the narrator is really offending this hero of Ukraine. But you had to read between the lines. And we well know that censors do not read between the lines if there is no education for this. And we can say most of my colleagues are also believing in the narrator. I would not say that I am the first one and the only one who sees that this narrator is a liar. But what I told you about the poem is rare, we can say, because most of my colleagues would follow the narrator. But my colleagues don't love the poem because of feeling that this is ambivalent, that it's a little strange poem. But to understand what is the real story is a little bit difficult, and you have to go against the text. And with a post-structuralist and postmodernist viewpoint, you can do this. But without this, might be very difficult to understand the poem in this way. And I see that Volkov, this is a contemporary poet, is reading Pushkin in this way, and this helps us to understand the poem anew.
Thank you very much.
So I have the questions because I'm not very convinced, I must say. I am maybe, so I am not totally convinced, I must say. Because I think you're trying to defend Pushkin, you know, and literature, maybe Russian poetry. But how can you explain that I think 2 years or 3 years later, Pushkin is wrote to the slanderers of Russia about about Poland, very cruel poem, or Borodino. For me, you probably know the work by my colleague Eva Thompson, Imperial Knowledge. It was very published, I think, 15 years ago. It was very, I think, pioneering book because for the first time it showed how literature, which is sometimes admired in so-called West, Russian literature had this function of legitimation of the empire. And if you said about this cruelty, I think it is a very persistent motive in Russian culture to say, yeah, cruelty is something what we should accept actually. Yeah, the cruel Tsar, he has to fulfill his duty in order to preserve the empire and so on. So this is my question, but main is how you explain your these poems about Poland 3 years later, if Pushkin was so critical about Russia and the elect of the freedom. And also one remark, you mentioned on the Mazepa in Słowacki, but of course there is we know that the proper name of Mazepa was Jan Kołodyński, and that he was in the Słowacki drama. He was, of course, on the court of Jan Kazimir, Polish king. And this I think it would be very interesting also to look more precisely and the Polish sources and how Mazepa was presented from the Polish perspective. Actually, Polish Szlachcic, Polish who went to the Ukraine. Of course, he was Ruthenian origin, but and then if we were talking about transmission, transmitted this Polish idea of freedom to the Cossack. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your remarks. About Poland in Pushkin's work, I have to think a little bit more and then to read a new lecture, I think. I would say that this is connected to his complicated relationship with Mickiewicz. We have to see this. This is one strength we can say, and the other thing is we have to read all these poems against the grain, against that what is on the surface. And we have very good to have a deeper look also at Borodino. We cannot do this at this time here. I would like to draw attention to another poem on Peter I. This is another Imperial or an empire poem. This is Bronze Horseman. This is also on the surface a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also on the surface a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of Peter and the empire. This is also a poem, which is a praise of but when you have a closer look, you will also read another story in it. And I guess we can do the same thing with Borodino. You should understand that that Pushkin is all the time read by Nikolai I. Every word he's saying in a private letter to his wife, to his friends, in his diary, everything is read by the Tsar or the chief of the Sacred Police. And every word Pushkin is saying or writing is to be double read. On the one hand, for the officials, on the other hand, Pushkin was a fighter for freedom, and not only a freedom of his person and Russian individuals, but also for smaller countries, for, I would like to say, the Ukrainians, that is for sure. With Poland, there might be a little bit another story. I have to have a look at it, but I guess that we can find there also a sympathy for the own rights, for the suffering Poland has in the 18th and the 19th century. Pushkin is well aware of this, but there are some complications also. I mentioned it already with Mickiewicz there, that has to be a look at. And your other question with Slovatsky, this is really interesting. There's a whole strand of the Mazepa story. Mazepa is not a Ukrainian, but a Polish nobleman. This is also interesting that the myth on Mazepa might be adopted by some Polish writers. And the case of Slovatsky, I think, is less a piece about history than a mysterious drama, because there are some aspects in the history of the young Mazepa here where we see that he undergoes a transformation in a spiritual order. For instance, he is buried alive, and after this he is coming again to life. This is, we can say, an initiation story. And we have to read the poem in this context, I think, and not in the historical context. Yes, thank you. And we should discuss it, I think, in another time.
If there's anyone else?
It's a question from Gerd Morgenthaler.
Yes. I would like to ask a question too, if possible. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can the audience in Poznan hear me?
I think
Hear you, yes. Sorry, but we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much, Henrique, for this profound interpretation of the poems. I have a very simple question of someone who has not much knowledge about the region, and I would simply like to understand the position of the Cossacks. The Cossacks, they seem to have been a multinational group. Perhaps you can explain who they were and how are they seen in Russian imperial self-understanding, and how are they seen in Ukraine? Does any of these two sides claim them for them, or are they considered as being enemies?
Yes, the name Cossacks, this is from Turkish language, means a free warrior. And in reality, we have Cossacks beginning from the 15th, 16th century as a special group. And they are various soldiers of peasants who left their country. Mm-hmm. They escaped from slavery, from army, and so on and so on. And they are coming from several nations or ethnic groups. There might be Tatars, Russians, Polish people from the Ukrainian country. This was a divided land, we can say, and was part of several states of Poland, Lithuanian, for instance, of Muscovia, and so on. And these Cossacks, they invented their own social and military order. They had their own law. And this law was based on election. They elected the hetman, and the hetman was the leader in the military and in the civil order. And the Cossacks themselves were multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic, we can say. They have several languages. And the Cossack were several groups. They lived on several rivers and had their names from these rivers and had several, we can say, state-like buildings. And this changed through history. And at some time, several of the kingdoms in this region invited them to service, and they were paid for this or had some properties, land ownership and so on, or get nobility and so on and so on. They had some advantages of serving. And they could have some regions in their own order and with their own state. This was the left bank Ukraine for some time, and then they had the chance to get the right bank Ukraine united. This was in the time of Mazepa, for instance, and they get to some power. But most of the time they had difficulties because the neighbors were all the time going against them and would like to have their land for their own and so on. And for these reasons, they get on some diplomatic strategies and to get some treaties, to have some protectorate relationships and to have some help against other countries. And so they were sometimes with Poland, sometimes with Muscovy. And the most important treaties about I spoke in the lecture, this is in the middle of the 17th century, where they did a treaty with Moscow on, this was we can say a protectorate. Moscow should give some safety for them, but on the other hand, the Cossack state have to get in civil service or in military service for the Russians, for the Muscovians. But they had a sovereignty, and both Poland, both Muscovian were well aware about this, that this state could like to have more for its own and being a sovereign state. And that was not one of the neighbors would like to have. And so it was a struggle for freedom and independence of this region all the time going on. And we had some decades with a certain freedom, we can say. And at another time, this freedom was not so large. And then we had a time that they destroyed the freedom. The last hetmanate was under Katarina II. She closed the hetmanate, but in reality, already under Peter, the Cossack hetmanate was already not independent and was part of, so we can say, Muscovian empire. And another part was in the hand of Poland and so on. This is a story about transformation all the time and the struggle for freedom and independence of this region. And this struggle was all the time lost again and again.
Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I guess we should move on, but let's thank again Professor Dr. Stahl for her stimulating lecture.
Thank you.